Took the blue from the skies and the pretty girl's eyes and the touch of old glory's hue, and gave it to the men who proudly wear the U.S. Air Force blue. The U.S. Air Force blue.
The 1950 holiday season brought a time of transition to the 307th Bomb Group in the Korean War. The prospect of a quick win through air power dissolved with the introduction of massive numbers of Chinese soldiers into the ground war. The group's loss of an air crew in November to Soviet fighters was a stark reminder that survival in aerial warfare is equal parts skill and luck. The mounting damage from enemy anti-aircraft artillery generated an ominous aura of vulnerability to shards of angry metal and blood-red explosions that World War II veterans found only too familiar. Early anticipation of Tampa Bay by Christmas Day vanished as the record cold Korean winter engulfed the men of the 307th in a frigid environment of bitter, often wet conditions. With United Nations forces confronting an estimated 200,000 Chinese troops between the Yalu and Changchun rivers, General MacArthur ordered a fighting withdrawal back to Pyongyang. By the 1st of December, it was apparent that United Nations forces, quote, facing the entire Chinese nation in an undeclared war, end quote, would have to withdraw back to Seoul. Contingency plans were drawn up to use atomic bombs if necessary to avert the loss of the entire peninsula. General MacArthur pushed for approval to bomb Chinese troop concentrations in Manchuria, but President Truman was determined to go only so far as the United Nations would allow. Taking the war beyond the Korean Peninsula would not meet with Allies' approval. This was especially so among the Allies providing ground troops for the war: the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Turkey. At issue was whether taking the war to China would precipitate a broader war with Russia, a war that would risk escalating to a third world war. The difference this time was the existence of the atomic bomb. Earlier in the war, the government considered using atomic bombs as a potential course of action under some circumstances. Many U.S. leaders had persuaded themselves that the deployment of B-29s to Germany and England during the Berlin blockade in 1948 had deterred the Soviets from rolling their thousands of tanks into Western Europe, even though no atomic bombs were in fact moved, and none of the B-29s were either the silver plate or saddle tree coated aircraft capable of carrying the bomb. The 307th was part of that 1948 maneuver. In June 1950, Strategic Air Command again deployed B-29s to England as a show of resolve to the Soviets and a signal of support to Allies. This time, some were nuclear capable. And at the end of July, President Truman approved a proposal to deploy B-29s to Guam as a similar show of force. These SAC bombers had atomic bombs in their bomb bays, although they did not have their fissile cores inserted. Success on the ground at Pusan and Incheon kept those plans on the shelf. Now, at the end of November, facing the prospect of an even more catastrophic defeat, the atomic bomb option was back on the table. In a November 30th news conference, President Truman put it this way.
At the White House in Washington, top defense officials of the nation gathered to discuss the gravest world crisis since Poland and Pearl Harbor. The flagrant aggression of Chinese communist troops in Korea arouses the country's ire. With the North Korean bandits well under control and with the promise that UN troops would be withdrawn, the unexpected entry of 300,000 Red Chinese across the Manchurian border may well precipitate World War III. President Truman voices his accusation of red imperialism.
The forces of the United Nations are in Korea to put down an aggression that threatens not only the whole fabric of the United Nations, but all human hopes of peace and justice. If the United Nations yields to the forces of aggression, no nation will be safe or secure. If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere. We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
On the battlefront in Korea, United Nations forces fight desperately to meet the Red attack. Here our troops must face what General MacArthur has termed a new war. Outnumbered more than 2 to 1 by Chinese and North Koreans, the UN forces hope to regroup and to meet the overwhelming attack which has broken their fluid lines of defense across northern Korea. The president has stated that the use of the atomic bomb is being considered to halt the communist onrush inspired by Russia. His hope is that the employment of this devastating weapon will be unnecessary, but the final hope lies with the United Nations.
In the official White House transcript, Truman's answers to reporters' questions off camera included this exchange. Question: Mr. President, will attacks in Manchuria depend on action in the United Nations? The President: yes, entirely. Question: in other words, if the United Nations resolution should authorize General MacArthur to go farther than he has, he will. The President: we will take whatever steps are necessary to meet the military situation, just as we always have. A reporter asked, will that include the atomic bomb? And the President replied, that includes every weapon that we have. The reporter pressed, Mr. President, you said every weapon that we have. Does that mean that there is active consideration of the use of the atomic bomb? Harry Truman, the only man on the planet who could authorize use of nuclear weapons, affirmed, there has always been active consideration of its use. I don't want to see it used. It is a terrible weapon, and it should not be used on innocent men, women, and children who have nothing whatever to do with this military aggression. That is what happens when it is used. After World War II and the 1946 Bikini Atoll atomic bomb tests, a new series of modified B-29s, codenamed Saddle Tree, were produced to deliver the first production atomic bombs, the Mark IV. The Mark IV was a follow-on to the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki. It fit more readily in a B-29 bomb bay and did not need a trench under the aircraft in order to load it. About 117 operational B-29s had been modified to employ the Mark IV, but it is not known how many, if any, were in service in the 307th in 1950. We do know that several 307th crewmen were experienced with B-29 atomic bomb operations from Operation Crossroads, or from atomic bomb targeting experience with SAC and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. For the 307th, life was miserable in Tent City No. 2, which was now the only tent city on the island. Tent stoves were brought into each tent, but the 307th lived in a cold and drafty slum. In a morale-busting double standard, the other SAC B-29 group, the 19th, was housed in concrete buildings and operated out of Quonset huts. One small victory by supply staff delivered fresh pillowcases to Kadena for the first time since the initial deployment in August. The pace of the air war quickened in December. Far Eastern Air Force's Bomber Command's plan was for each B-29 group to exert a maximum effort 24 ships every third day. But the weather took its toll on men and equipment, and that plan didn't last a week as B-29 parts grew scarce and increased sick calls among crew made it necessary to borrow resources across groups to meet the overly ambitious intent. Starting on the 8th of December, each group was to fly 12 aircraft for 2 consecutive days, then stand down for recovery on the 3rd day. Aerial dogfights became commonplace in the skies over North Korea as outclassed American fighters took on an ever-increasing number of MiG-15s. These 3 fighter pilots are interrogated after they shot down 2 North Korean Yak fighters in a mission to MiG Alley over Sinuiju in November 1950. MiG attacks on B-29s were rare because BOMCOM avoided targets in MiG Alley after the losses of November. The 372nd Squadron had suffered significant damage and crew casualties in a November 14th strike on the bridge at Sinuiju. Just after bombs away, 4 of their B-29s suffered damage from MiG-15 strikes and flak hits. 2 made it to Itazuki Air Base in Japan. The other 2 barely made it to the base at Kimpo. One of the ships at Kimpo, aircraft 1676, suffered brake failure on landing and struck 4 parked fighter aircraft. 3 crew had been injured and immediately evacuated to the hospital at Itazuki. The Itazuki aircraft rejoined the 307th at Kadena within a week, but the 2 at Kimpo required major repairs that could only be done in the depot at Itazuki, and those 2 aircraft could not be ferried from Kimpo to Itazuki depot until the 13th of December, even as the Chinese hordes continued their march to the south. the 307th pressed on, accomplishing 20 missions each month through March. For much of the month of December 1950, the 307th's targets were troop concentrations, weapons storage facilities, vehicle shelters, and supply caches. Most of those targets were hidden within civilian buildings in small towns and villages. Here, Colonel John Proctor, the 307th's operations officer, works on mission planning for a December strike on a critical hub in North Korea where rail, road, and river routes converged. While such targets were planned as a result of strategic reconnaissance missions, the 307th's B-29 crews also seized on targets of opportunity. Tactical air crews often noted significant enemy concentrations as the Chinese threw caution to the wind, hoping to catch up with the retreating United Nations forces in broad daylight. They moved south over exposed roads rather than the covered mountain trails they had used in their initial attacks. And they continued to march, even when struck by tactical aircraft. Often, the 5th Air Force requested diversion of medium bombers to such area targets. This debriefing produced significant interdiction targets that were passed on to B-29 aircraft scheduled for strikes shortly to follow. In total, the 307th dropped general-purpose bombs from 500 to 2,000 pounds on 20 different towns throughout the month of December. During the first 3 weeks of December, when UN ground forces were largely out of contact with the enemy, and BOMCOM had completed its strategic air campaign, Far Eastern Air Force's airmen were estimated to have killed or wounded enemy personnel equivalent in number to the aggregate strength of 5 Chinese divisions. Perhaps motivated by the Communists' November surprise offensive, the 307th delivered an extra special present to Pyongyang on Christmas Eve. Armament crews and loaders were awestruck when the first AN-56 Mike 4,000-pound bombs arrived at Kadena for Santa to deliver down the chimney of the Communists' headquarters building. An RF-80 secured this daring nose camera shot of Communist headquarters in Pyongyang. As Christmas Day approached, tensions rose at Kadena. The growing size and capability of the Communist Chinese Air Forces brought concern among Far Eastern Air Force's intelligence analysts that it would be feasible for the enemy to carry out raids reaching the island. So the entire base was on alert for the 2 weeks encompassing the Christmas and New Year's holidays. The men dug deep and wide foxholes on either side of the revetments, fortified with 500 sandbags. Each foxhole was large enough to accommodate both maintenance and flight crews. Leadership inspected and inventoried all personal field gear. Supply issued replacements. Everyone was required to always carry their personal weapon, a carbine or a pistol. No more than half the men in the group could be away from the tent area during non-duty hours, and each aircraft had a crew standing by for emergency aircraft evacuation. Christmas itself was bittersweet. Makeshift decorations emerged in and around all of Tent City No. 2, and between missions the Chapel Choir had rehearsed its Christmas carols to perfection. Dinner in the base mess on the 24th was supplemented with a fine eggnog concocted by the mess crew, with key ingredients provided from officers' and NCO private stashes. On Christmas Eve, before departure for the strike on Pyongyang, the Catholic chaplain held a midnight mass, followed by a communion breakfast next morning in the mess. When the men recovered from the Christmas Eve strike on Pyongyang, the sun shone brightly all day. Temperatures soared from sub-freezing well up into the 40s. It was a somber holiday season for the 307th Bombardment Group on temporary duty in the theater of war, as the men came to grips with the reality that they were in for a long, hard fight for the duration. It was cold. It was wet. Morale was at an all-time low. But motivation prevailed among the airmen of the 307th to do their duty to their utmost on each and every mission. Morale lifted tremendously with word in early January that crews would soon start rotating back to the States, to be replaced with crews that had been preparing for deployment back at MacDill. Squadron commanders briefed their men on how it would work. Ground crews were to rotate at a rate of 20% per month. 25 combat crews would arrive in February, another 25 in March. Each replacement would go through about a week of combat orientation before filling into the mission rotation. The training included briefings and exercises on mission planning, radio procedure, aircraft identification, and armament. Aircraft identification was particularly critical because the U.S. jets and Soviet MiGs presented small and fleeting targets, difficult for gunners to make positive identification before pulling the trigger. Each new crew member then went out on a combat mission with an experienced crew before going out on their first combat mission as a team. The 307th renewed its vigor in bombing North Korea. The leap in morale generated renewed earnestness to defeat the Chinese and North Korean enemy. As the ground war stabilized across the 38th parallel by mid-January, the 307th focused its fire on Pyongyang. Pyongyang was the principal target, struck on 10 of the group's 19 missions in January 1951. The first two Pyongyang missions, January 3rd and 5th, were max-effort incendiary raids. Each night, 27 of the 307th's 28 B-29s dropped over 1,000 E-48s on military targets in the communist capital city. On the 11th of January, the 307th tried out some new B-29 bombing techniques over Pyongyang. 4 ships executed a nighttime harassment bombing mission. Each ship was over the target at 1-hour intervals throughout the night in the first B-29 night mission in Korea. The 307th employed 500-pound and 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs with combination proximity and time delay fuses. The proximity fuse was screwed into the nose end of the bomb and set to detonate about 1,000 feet above the ground. In January, a team of experts arrived and reminded armaments personnel to use a time delay fuse in combination with the proximity fuse. This dual fuse arrangement was used mainly against troop concentrations, showering thousands of steel fragments earthward. They had been employed once before in the Korean War air campaign by B-29s, but BOMCOM discontinued their use when they detonated while still close to the formation, buffeting the aircraft and throwing bombardiers off, not to mention causing no small measure of anxiety among the crews. The proximity fuse was in fact a miniaturized radio transmitter with an equally small receiver to detect reflections of the wave. Whenever the amplitude of the reflected signal exceeds a calculated value for the desired altitude, the fuse triggers its detonator. The time delay fuse was a set of vanes screwed into the tail of the bomb, and it was set to arm the bomb only when it was a safe distance away. 307th crews used the proximity time delay fuse combination to great effect on the January 11th mission. As United Nations forces continued their retreat to the south in the face of sustained Chinese and North Korean advance, the 307th found their former refuge at Kimpo airfield just outside of Seoul as one of their targets. But aerial resistance was light and the group suffered no damage from flak or fighters. Toward the end of January, there were indications the enemy assault was nearing a culminating point. The 307th's targets shifted back to the north to disrupt enemy troop movements and supplies. Far Eastern Air Forces Commander Lieutenant General Stratemeyer issued a letter of commendation for the group's successful mission on February 1st, dropping all 7 spans of a key bridge into the river at Tanchan. But as less experienced crews flew their initial baptism of fire, and despite the lack of enemy air opposition and light flak over target areas, damage to aircraft and injuries to airmen began to increase. On February 10th missions to destroy bridges, 3 aircraft were damaged by flak. 2 of these made it back to Kadena, but 1 had to divert to Itazuki, Japan for depot repairs. In February, the first replacement crews arrived from MacDill and began their orientation training. By the end of the month, 6 complete crews and 3 near-complete were on station at Kadena, along with support airmen including 100 enlisted and 9 officers. 8 crews and 7 enlisted men returned to the United States. The returning 307th Airmen had an average of 53 combat missions per crew. On 23 March, while 45 Sabres fought MiGs at the Yalu, 22 B-29s of the 19th and 307th groups returned to MiG Alley to destroy the railroad bridges at Kogangyang and Changju. On this day, the medium bomber crews met no air opposition of any kind. 307th Intel and Ops officers and NCOs had become expert in precision planning for such missions. In this photo, the 307th's Captain Warren Healy, Captain John F. McHugh, and Master Sergeant Henry Schultz used the slide rule compass and calculator wheel to plot a precise path for a bomb run in February 1951. But overall combat effectiveness had dropped in March, the effect of new crews, many of whom did not have the prior experience that the initial crews brought to the fight in Korea. Most replacement bombardiers, for example, had fewer than 10 drops before deploying to Kadena. On March 29th, 7 aircraft suffered flak damage, one with more than 30 holes. The 307th's bombing effectiveness had dropped in March 1951. Nevertheless, United Nations ground troops recaptured Seoul and stabilized the line of contact along the 38th parallel. In this period of transition, from the 1st of December 1950 to the 30th of March 1951, the 307th executed 78 missions, 21 on Pyongyang, 17 on railroad bridges, and 40 on 18 other military targets. Colonel Hilger was among the last of the combat crews to return to the USA. After a change of command formation and speech before the entire group in formation on March 15th, he handed the flag over to Colonel John Reynolds.